I'm really appreciating that you're here. We have a special civility program today, and I am very honored to introduce our guests. The civility, whoops, that won't work. The Civility Lecture Series has been ongoing since 2011, and it brings together experts in their field to talk about civility and what it means to them. We do this with the Dylan Schneider Group and Hertz Media. Today we have moderating Jared Baker. He's been a journalist for more than 30 years, writing and broadcasting for some of the world's most famous news organizations, including his tenure at the Financial Times, the Times of London, and the BBC. Currently, he is editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal, and his weekly column for the editorial page, Free Expression, appears each Tuesday. Andrew Roberts, as of 2022, is now in the House of Lords. He's currently the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, a visiting professor at the War Studies Department at King's College London, and the Lehrman Institute Lecturer at the New York Historical Society. You might remember him from his visit last year when he discussed his work, George III, The Life and Reign of Britain's Most Misunderstood Monarch. General David Petraeus is a retired United States Army general and public official. He served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency from September 2011 to November 2012. Prior to that, he had served in the United States Army for 37 years. His last assignments in the Army were as commander of the International Security Assistance Force and commander, U.S. Forces, Afghanistan. General Petraeus has spoken in our civility lecture before. If you're here, it was our last public program in March 2020 before the library closed due to the pandemic. And with that, please, I welcome to the stage.
Alice, thank you very much indeed for that very warm introduction. Thank you all for being here on a Sunday afternoon. So when the New York Giants are playing, apparently winning as well for a change, which is nice to know. It's a real pleasure for me to be here and a privilege for me to be here with two such distinguished gentlemen. I know the general rubric of these conversations is civility, but I don't think we'll have any difficulty at all maintaining civility with a member of the House of Lords and a general, a retired general of the US Armed Forces. But of course, we have got a fascinating book to talk about, which is where we want to start, as well as talking. I want to get into what these two great authors think about current events and how we can apply the lessons that they talk about in their book to the rather alarming and disturbing current events that are happening in the world, from the Middle East to Europe and elsewhere. And I want to get into that. But if I may, gentlemen, start with you both. Just you've both written. Andrew, you've written very, very widely, many historical books. General, you've written too. How did this come about? How did the two of you come together to start this project? If I can start with you, General, just give us a background to how this all came about.
Yeah. So
yes,
I'll let him explain.
How did I tell you about that, and also display the product? There you go. The idea came shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when I called up David and I said, I think we're going to need a book on the military history background of this war, as opposed to just the geopolitical or political background. And he immediately jumped to the idea. So we went to the publishers, HarperCollins, and they said, how are you going to divvy up the chapters? I said, well, David's going to write about all the countries he's invaded. And I will, and he also wrote the Vietnam chapter, crucial Vietnam chapter, and I was going to do the rest. And it's worked out extremely well. The Wall Street Journal, in the course of calling it the best book of military history since the dawn of the nuclear age, which I thought was rather fabulous, also said that I have the capacity to smooth off General Petraeus's hard literary edges. So there we go.
Very true. And we work back and forth. I mean, literally thousands of emails over the course of this. You know, we'd take turns leading the writing and many backs and forth. We'd done a lot before. We forget all the way back when it was or who brought us together originally, but just the Winston Churchill book alone, which one of Andrew's greatest. Of course, this is his 20th book, by the way, but the first with a co-author, and I feel very privileged to be the first co-author. But that book alone, we did 5 events together on the stage of the New York Historical Society. You know, it started out just the book itself, and I would interview him because I was fascinated by Churchill as well. And then we did, of course, Churchill in the military. Then we did Churchill in intelligence. Those 2 were fairly natural for me. Then there was Churchill in the royalty, which was fun. And then the final one was Churchill and his friends, which was particularly delightful. It was great fun. Churchill even had his own club, as I recall.
Yes, the other club it was called.
But so we've had a lot of fun, and he had me at the Clifton Literary Festival, of which he's a co-founder, even though I hadn't written a book twice before finally we were back there this last time. We have both written the book together. So it was a wonderful partnership. And, you know, the Baron Roberts here of Belgravia is a quintessential Brit with a incredibly prodigious productivity, brilliant recall, prodigious research, and all the rest of that. But just as you'll see, actually a great deal of fun to be with. He's actually hosted me at his beautiful white townhouse in Belgravia a number of occasions. They're a bit distressed there. This is his constituency again, since he is Baron Roberts of Belgravia. There's a bit of distress there because about 1/3 of his constituents in that extraordinary area actually haven't been back there since the Russians invaded Ukraine. But we hope the lights will come back on soon after Putin capitulates.
One of the things we want to talk about the key lessons, the key lessons you draw, and I should say, you know, it is a terrific book. I'm sure many of you have already had a chance to read it. The Wall Street Journal, as ever, was of course right in its review and its judgment, and it's a great book not just because of the things we're going to talk about, the lessons that you've learned from these conflicts over the last 75 years, which is as a terrific sort of canter through the history of the last 75 years. I know you quite explicitly say at the beginning, it's obviously not a political history, but it's a remarkable account and a reminder actually how many conflicts there have been, including in that period that we think of as the Cold War, 45 years or so, how many hot wars there were in the Cold War. So one of the things I did want to ask you just about the methodology of the book, and I always want to ask when 2 people have worked on a book, and you've said how you divided up the writing, but you draw a lot of lessons. Were there anything you sort of disagreed about, or was it sort of spontaneous unanimity in terms of the lessons that we are to draw from these conflicts?
I can't remember any complaints, but sorry, any falling out over anything at all, really. But tell the
I was
audience
a little
about
bit
the
worried that he was lagging behind me for a while. I mean, that's fairly common.
We're familiar with your running history, Jim.
No.
So we're all there.
general
But I'm quite
competitiveness,
disciplined about it, and I was cranking mine out, and I think I'd already shipped 2 chapters off to him that were reasonably close to final, and I said, Andrew, how are you doing? And then all of a sudden they just started pouring forth.
Right. Anyway, going back to the central lesson of the book.
There's a huge big idea, and it has to do with the importance of big ideas and strategic leadership. And I think when I did the civility lecture, and Bob and Jen, thanks again for the invitation to do this. Thanks for all you do for this community, for New York City, for the Metropolitan Club, where we'll be on Tuesday or Wednesday or whenever it is. Yeah. I talked in that time about a leader has to get 4 tasks right. You have to get the big ideas right. You have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization or whatever it is you're leading. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas, and then you have to determine how you need to refine them and do it again and again and again. I've had this explicit construct in mind. I employed it specifically, starting with the surge in Iraq, the first 4-star combat assignment I had, then at U.S. Central Command, the second, then Afghanistan, the third, at the CIA as well. It applies in business, it applies in the nonprofit sector, et cetera, but it really applies when it comes to conflict. If the strategic leader, a president, and actually then the military commander of the campaign, if they don't get it right, you're building on a shaky intellectual foundation. I don't care how impressive their communication skills are, how wonderful their example, their energy, their inspiration, all the rest of that, it doesn't matter. And as we went through the book, we realized this increasingly with each successive chapter. And then we went back and rewrote the introduction to make even more explicit how important the quality of strategic leadership is. If you have sound strategic leadership, if you get the overarching big ideas right, then if you translate those from, say, the level of a president or a prime minister in the theater of war and perform the others, you have a very good chance of prevailing. If you don't get the big ideas right, then it's all for naught. I'll just note that when it came to Vietnam, and we may have some Vietnam veterans in here, I don't believe that we got the big ideas right for Vietnam until 1968. Keep in mind, we started there somewhere in the mid-1950s after the French had a horribly bad big idea. Remember, they were frustrated that they couldn't bring the communists to battle. They were very elusive. They were guerrilla. So they decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to create this huge base way out into the hinterlands called Dien Bien Phu. And we'll build this up. It'll have a real magnetic attraction. They won't be able to resist coming to attack us. And of course, that proved true. The problem was the outcome was not what the French had envisioned. They literally lost. They had to capitulate. They went into captivity for a period. And then ultimately there was an agreement in Geneva, which partitioned North and South Vietnam and so forth. Of a side note, only his lordship here could have discovered this, but he pointed out to me, he said, did you know that the 5 little outposts that were outside Dien Bien Phu proper were named for the mistresses of the French commander? There were 5 of them, count them. In any event, but again, if you don't get the big idea right, it doesn't much matter. We have a number of cases in which we do get it right. I think George H.W. Bush, who right at the start of the first National Security Council meeting, right after the Iraqis invaded, Saddam's army invaded Kuwait, the military goes over from the Pentagon. They're not that enthusiastic about this. A lot of unknowns there. Saudi Arabia might not even take us. They're burdened by the lessons of Vietnam, don't want to get in another long, dragged out war without knowing how it's going to end and all this. And Bush simply starts the meeting by saying, this shall not stand. And okay, got it. You know, and we guys in the military, we can translate that. We got it. And then figure out how to operationalize that idea. And of course, it's a brilliant job then in the theater of war, U.S. Central Command, General Schwarzkopf, great support by General Powell and the chiefs in the Pentagon. By the way, I was the aide to one of those chiefs at that time, the Army Chief of Staff, and had a great vantage point. Think of Maggie Thatcher. Again, another great.
Yeah, Margaret Thatcher showed tremendous moral courage, really, at the time of the invasion of the Falklands, because pretty much any previous prime minister would have done the same thing as we had been doing ever since the Suez Crisis, which had sort of broken the will of the British establishment in many ways geopolitically. I think you'd agree with that, Jerry.
Very much.
But instead, she very much also said this will not stand, and she gave the command to the admirals and the generals, and it too was an extremely difficult operation that had to take place 8,000 miles away from the base, and then she, through a brilliant connection with her admirals and generals, ensured that it was fought despite being an amphibious operation, which is tremendously difficult, of course, and a long way from the place where they landed to capture the capital of the Falklands, Port Stanley. And it all came off because she was willing to give that necessary impetus, and as I say, in a completely different way from other prime ministers.
You both give. I just want to move on quickly. As you say in the outset of the book, right in the introduction, there are 3 key lessons, if you like, 3 key lessons, which is that the strategic leaders have to have
4 key tasks.
4 key tasks. Sorry, so they have to have
ideas, communicate, oversee, and refine.
And refine. So you both give them very good examples.
We'll give you some more, actually.
Well, I wanted to move. Okay, but I want to also you've given very good examples of ones where the leaders had exactly those. Yep. And executed them very, very well. Can you give us, from this 75-year history, give us examples where that didn't happen, where it went wrong?
Let me give a couple of those, and I'll give it back to Andrew to talk about Malaya and Oman. So both Iraq and Afghanistan, frankly, we had very impressive military campaigns. Afghanistan, of course, came first, a few months after 9/11, actually less than 2 months after that. A handful of special operations forces on horseback and CIA officers with money, and then the Northern Alliance forces of various warlords took down the Taliban, eliminated the Al-Qaeda sanctuary in which the 9/11 attacks were planned. But of course, Osama bin Laden did get away. But we owned Afghanistan then, and it seemed to be going along reasonably well. But the truth was, we took our eye off that ball very substantially. And my assessment is that we didn't even get the inputs right, the subsequent inputs, for 9 years. And by inputs, I'm talking about the right big ideas. It had to be a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign. There's no, you could argue all you wanted to around the Situation Room that it could just be counterterrorism. It had to be counterinsurgency. The forces that were killing innocent Afghans, Afghan forces, and coalition forces were insurgents, the Taliban and the Haqqani network and a handful of others. Yes, there was Al-Qaeda, and we ensured that they never were able to come back. But we didn't get that construct right. We then didn't get the right level of resources, not even remotely, until late 2010. Then we had to get the organizational architecture right. That's crucial. If you want to go after corruption, you probably ought to have an anti-corruption task force. If you want to reduce the impact of illegal narcotics, you probably ought to have a counter-narcotics task. And again, Afghan local police program, all these elements really were not established until that late. We did finally get that right. We made a lot of progress. Then we just lacked the strategic patience. And I would argue that we had very viable alternatives that were much better than withdrawing the final 3,500 troops when we hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months. And the cost was really quite modest. When the final decision was announced to withdraw, which continued with the decision of the previous administration that reached an agreement with the Taliban, and I thought was one of the worst in our diplomatic history. When I heard that we were going to continue with that and withdraw, I said that I felt we would come to regret the decision, and I hope we have, because the outcome has been not just heartbreaking and tragic, but I think disastrous. If you look at Iraq, again, great campaign. I was part of that one as a division commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division. I could actually see the assumptions who had been provided invalidated sort of one by one during the fight to Baghdad. That's when I made the mistake of saying out loud to my embedded journalist, 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner Rick Atkinson, "Tell me how this ends," because it was clear to me it wasn't going to end the way we'd been told it would. But, again, a great campaign, take down Baghdad, take down the regime, and then what? And the organization that was supposed to take over didn't do very well. It gets fired. It gets replaced by another one. We should have established an embassy right away. We didn't, I think, because Secretary Rumsfeld wanted to continue to run the war and not share it with the Secretary of State, who obviously would have supervised an embassy. We didn't elevate the commander to a 4-star. In fact, we had the junior 3-star in the entire Army, who did not prove up to the task. And then to compound all that, we fire the Iraqi military, all of it, instead of using it, and don't even tell them how we're going to help them provide for their families. So we've created hundreds of thousands whose stake is to oppose the new Iraq. That's their incentive rather than to support it. And then we compound that by firing down to level 4, the Ba'ath Party. Now, you needed to kill or capture the top 2, maybe even 3 levels, and we did catch up with Saddam's sons. And when they refused to surrender and shot at our troops, we flew 17 TOW missiles, anti-tank missiles through the window, and then there was no more shooting back. But at the level 4, these were the bureaucrats that we actually needed to run the country. We didn't know anything about this country. In fact, we didn't know with sufficient rigor the country that we had invaded, frankly. And we could have used them. I was able to get a special exception up where I was in Mosul. We jumped up there from Baghdad, and that made a huge difference. It's why everything went much better up there until ultimately that was undone after I left. And we did it again during the surge. I got that authority again. But again, these were catastrophically bad, big ideas. Again, to fire tens of thousands of Western educated, by the way. I mean, these people drank. What more could you want in partners in an Islamic country? And of course, what replaced them were much more Islamist and much less secular. So again, those are very, very bad, big ideas. Now we sort of got it back together, the surge. I've often noted the surge that mattered most wasn't the extra forces. It was the surge of ideas. We changed the big ideas 180 degrees. Think about that. A lot of books out there about change leadership. Doesn't get any bigger than 180 degrees. And when it came to the biggest of the big ideas, which was that we had to live with the population, live with the people to secure them and take back control from the Iraqis. Another huge idea was that we cannot kill or capture our way out of an industrial strength insurgency. We have to reconcile with as many of the rank and file as we can as we intensify the effort to go after the irreconcilables, using about 12 to 15 targeted operations every night with our special mission unit forces. So it gives you some sense. In some cases, again, as I said, in Vietnam, it took us all the way until 1968 to get it right, with General Abrams coming in to replace Westmoreland, who constantly focused on the large war rather than on the one that mattered, the one in the villages and the hamlets where the people actually lived. But we did get it right then, and then didn't have the domestic.
Andrew, do you want to give us either successes or failures?
Yes, well, a couple of successes that the British had, although on a much, much smaller scale than Iraq, were the Malayan insurgency of 8-year insurgency in the 1950s and the Oman Dhofar uprising in the 1960s to mid-70s. And in each case, what the key figure did, Sir Gerald Templar in Malaya, and a close relationship between Sultan Qaboos of Oman and Sir John Akehurst, a British brigadier, was to offer something positive to the people. And in the case of Sir Gerald Templar, who came up with the phrase "hearts and minds," actually to offer independence to the Malaysians, which took place in 1957, and in Oman offer a huge degree of progress and modernity that the previous Sultan had not been offering at all. In fact, he was extraordinarily reactionary. He banned trousers, transistor radios, pressure cookers for some reason, and was really understandably sort of opposed by a good deal of his population. But once he was overthrown by his son, he was able to...
Shortly after he came home from Sandhurst.
That's right.
Apparently...
David's convinced that at Sandhurst you were taught how to overthrow your father.
If you're international.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But in each case, they were able to offer something positive, and this, in both cases, after some very serious fighting, of course, needless to say, did destroy the communist insurgencies in both of those places.
Before moving on to apply these lessons again to these conflicts that are really very much part of very much upon us today, one other question I had, which I think comes out in the book, but I'd like to hear you address it directly, is the relationship between civilian and military leaders and how important that is. And again, if you could give us examples where because you started off, General, talking about the strategic leader. Obviously, in democracies, the strategic leader is the civilian leadership, but the relationship between the president, the prime minister, the leading politicians, and the senior military is obviously critical. Both from your direct experience, but from some of the examples you give in your book, can you talk a bit about that relationship, and where that goes right and where it goes wrong?
I think the best relationship maybe in American military history, actually, and keep in mind my dissertation was on this subject when I did the PhD at Princeton, was between President George W. Bush and his commander and ambassador in the field during the surge in Iraq. After that stunning reversal of the Republican Party in 2006, they lost control of the House. They still did control the Senate. They'd already lost control of the House. The war in Iraq was going very poorly. So he replaced the Secretary of Defense, and basically he took over the Washington end of the war. He had not done that before. He had largely been allowing the Secretary of Defense to oversee it. Not saying he wasn't very heavily involved together with the Vice President, but it's wholly different when the president decides on something against the advice of his military leadership, sends a new commander out, empowers him, and starts running a meeting in Washington on a Monday morning at 7:30. Now, by the way, those of you ever look at the White House schedule, because it's public, there's nothing on there usually before 10 a.m., not even the intelligence briefing, although occasionally it is. But so he starts this on a Monday morning. Now, keep in mind, you start the week. You can imagine how early all the action officers had to come in to prepare their boss, to prepare their boss, to prepare the one who's going to go in and brief the Secretary of Defense or the chairman or the Secretary of State. And then they have to get over to that meeting. Of course, Washington rush hour traffic, but 7:30 to 8:30 in the morning. And he didn't ask people around the table, as one of his successors did, how's the war going? He said, General, Ambassador, how's it going? And that sends a massive message. Again, keep in mind that you not only get the big ideas right, his big idea was empower 2 new leaders and let, in particular, the military leader to implement what we'd just written in the counterinsurgency field manual. Because between my 3- and 4-star tours, and keep in mind I was there at the outset 2-star, went back very quickly to 3-star, and that was an extended tour. And then came home, and while I was home during that period, we did the counterinsurgency field manual. We tried to distill the lessons. We realized there's no manual for what it is we're actually trying to do out there. So and then when I went to see him before deploying, after being confirmed, he said, General, we're doubling down on Iraq. I said, Mr. President, your military is going all in, and we need the rest of government to go all in. He said, General, I will ensure that that happens, and he did. So that was an extraordinary, and plus in the field, a uniquely incredible relationship between the most gifted ambassador of his generation, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, and me. We even signed the campaign plan together. So it was a civil military campaign plan, not just military and embassy or civilian. We combined the 2 of them, and I took heat over that. They would ask me, why do you have all this civilian crap in your campaign plan? I say, well, because it's a civil military campaign. So that was really quite unique. It was not what we enjoyed subsequent, candidly. There was a little bit of if Bush did this, then we'll do this. So much less frequency of meetings and so forth. So, and then you also had in Afghanistan, you're complicated because you have a NATO chain of command and also a US chain of command. And the NATO one was not trivial. You had 50,000 non-US troops. So you had to pay a good bit of attention to that as well. And then, again, a little bit less of the kind of intense focus. I mean, President Bush was riveted on this. He knew that this was a legacy item, and he needed to turn around a war that many felt shouldn't have been launched and turn it in. And we did. And we drove the level of violence down by nearly 90%. The Iraqis sustained that for 3.5 years until tragically, right after we withdrew our combat forces, Prime Minister Maliki pursued highly sectarian actions that tore the fabric of society again, took their eye off of the Islamic State, which we'd destroyed. Al-Qaeda in Iraq became the Islamic State, allowed them to reconstitute. Keep that in mind, by the way, when you talk about Gaza and Hamas. And then they created the first caliphate. We had to go back in and so forth. But so that was a uniquely, really extraordinary partnership. And I think I can't think of any that will ever actually touch that.
And examples of where it goes wrong. I mean, Vietnam would be a good example where Andrew, do you want to maybe talk about that?
The classic one is when the French in Algeria brought the civil and military leadership into one man, General Massu, who was both governor of Algeria and also commander of French forces there. And he essentially legitimized, overtly so, legitimized the use of torture. And that did 2 things. Firstly, it didn't bring in very much actionable information because, frankly, you'll tell anybody anything they want to know if they're torturing you. And secondly, it turned French domestic opinion against the whole operation because it was an instinctive, natural, historic part of the creation of the French Republic. The Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789. And so it seemed to be profoundly un-French to do this thing. And so that's a classic example, I think, of where civil military should have been able to have stopped something, but instead it encouraged something.
I'm going to indulge my journalism here and ask you, how as you look at this, this covers this period again from sort of the 45 to 2023. That's been a period in which the media climate and the way in which the media cover wars has been transformed in all kinds of ways. And I want to ask you both, you know, and you, by the way, what impact in throughout these wars does public opinion, does the reporting of the war, does commentary on the war, what impact does that have both obviously on the politics, but obviously on the conduct of the war too? And we're seeing right now, and again, we're going to talk in a little bit about specifics about Gaza. You know, you've got a media now which covers wars in a way, I think, for example, would not have been the case even, you know, in the Second World War, which covers wars, which goes into Gaza, and, you know, as it turns out, we're pretty confident actually misreports a very important incident, which has tremendous effect on public opinion, on support for the war, support around the world. It has opinion, you know, in the region as well as back at home. How does, Andrew, I'll start with you on this. How does the way in which, you know, the media coverage of wars, how has that changed the way in which wars have to be conducted?
Well, obviously, it's tremendously important in a democracy. Totalitarian and authoritarian regimes who don't have fair reporting, classic example being Russia today with regard to Ukraine, it's not so important. One of the more successful wars that the British Empire, or indeed in this case the Commonwealth, fought was the Borneo confrontation in the 1960s, where they didn't let any journalists in at all. And so the entire war was fought in secret, which would be completely impossible to do, needless to say, with smartphones and so on today. But what happened was that the British Commonwealth forces didn't want anybody to know about it because they were making incursions into sovereign territory of Indonesia. And Indonesia didn't want anyone to know about it because they were essentially losing and didn't want to make their regime topple. And so this hard-fought jungle war was fought over many years, completely in secret, and they didn't allow any journalists to go there. And ultimately, we won.
And contrast that with Ukraine, which is the first war with the level of transparency that we see now. It's unprecedented. Even in Iraq, we didn't have anything like smartphones with ubiquitous internet access, social media platforms, and internet service providers that could allow you to upload videos, statements, whatever. And that makes it much, much more difficult, obviously. And that's before you add in the impact of disinformation, a very terrible example of which we saw in recent days, of course, when the Hamas accused Israel of bombing a hospital, causing 500 casualties. It turned out the number of casualties was actually 20. And then it turns out, you know, you have so much stuff over top of a battlefield now, you just have to rewind it, literally. And so they rewound one of the really key digital feeds that they use, which is from a Q-36 counter battery radar. It shows the tracks of the rockets that were being launched by actually the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another extremist group that works with Hamas. And you could see it. They were going right over the hospital, and then there was video of one that fell short. And so that was the cause of this. And yet that was a catalyst for very serious demonstrations throughout the Muslim world in the region, and even, frankly, near your neighborhood in Belgravia, not to mention in New York and elsewhere. So again, hugely challenging. I'll just note that the other challenge is, so when I commanded the surge in Iraq, we had big ideas for everything. And the big idea for dealing with the press was that we would be first with the truth. So we would try to beat the bad guys to the headline, because you don't want the bad guys to get the headline and say, you know, American forces commit atrocity in Sadr City. We want it to be Americans conduct raid in Sadr City, nab, you know, Abu whatever, a noted Shia militia extremist, and then they can have the subhead and accuse us of whatever they want. But then we also sought to do it with the truth. I said, we're not going to put lipstick on pigs anymore. If it's bad, we're going to say it's bad, and we're going to go out and explain how bad it was. We're going to describe what we believe took place, what we learned from it, and what we and our Iraqi partners will do in the future to mitigate the chances of it happening again. We also had a media monitoring operation. We actually hired a British public relations firm that helped us with this. We also had our own military, public affairs, and others. So we had every TV station, we had every radio station, we had every print media. That was doable. It took a lot. It was a little bit like a political campaign war room where you're watching for anything that is critical of you, and then you are pushing back if it is incorrect, if it's inaccurate. And if it's bad and we hadn't reported it, we need to get out ahead of it as well. Think about trying to do that now, though. I mean, there are so many different social media platforms. There are additional news channels that have gone further to the right or further to the left. And so the challenges are just incomparable, and yet you do have to deal with them.
Yes, one of the, in fact, the last chapter, chapter 10 of this book, is about the future of warfare. So we look at sensors and cyber and space and robotics and AI, drones and so on. But also what we look at is disinformation and the way in which an enemy will attempt to undermine national morale through using disinformation, use of deep fakes, for example, which are coming thick and fast, bots and so on. And it will undoubtedly be, it already is, certainly in Ukraine, but it will undoubtedly be a major aspect of future war. And so that's why we made sure that there was an aspect of that chapter.
Let's, again, I want to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. I'm sure there'll be plenty. But let's locate this now right in the present then, as we've been talking about. Let's talk about this war. We're in the early stages of a war that looks of, uncertain duration, could be quite a long war, uncertain geography. I think it's probably fair to say we don't know who's going to get involved. General and both of you, let me ask both of you, if he may already have done, I don't know this, but if Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu were to call you up and say, that we've seen obviously the very early stages so far, largely aerial response by Israel, but everybody's expecting any day now a ground invasion with then the objectives, they've made it clear their objectives to eradicate Hamas and to destroy Hamas. With your experience and the lessons from this book, General, what does Israel have to do, and particularly what mistakes does it have to avoid?
So let me sort of situate this, if I could, first. Yeah, I don't think we truly understand the context. I think we understand how horrific this has been, but let's put it in context. We lost nearly 3,000 Americans, innocent civilians, in the 9/11 attacks. The equivalent for us of what Israel has sustained would be over 50,000 now. Now it's up to 1,400. So do the math relative to that. And then look at the number of hostages. 200 hostages would be somewhere in the 6,000-7,000 range. So imagine if we had lost, again, over 50,000 Americans. That's killed, by the way, not just wounded. And then had, again, 6,000 or 7,000 hostages taken. And that's what we have to start with as we understand the situation in Israel. I do believe that America, and here I'm not just talking about President Biden and the executive branch, but also the legislative branch, Congress, and there's a delegation that just did a press conference over there, bipartisan, and they've got it right, and that is to have Israel's back, absolutely. But also, as you've noticed, there's been a tiny bit of caution. I actually thought that President Biden's speech, where he said, we have been through this, we sought revenge and vengeance, but you need to do it in a thoughtful and measured way. Not measured necessarily, you want to destroy Hamas. But again, you have to go about this in a thoughtful way, and you have to be very careful not to rush it. And I'm not just talking about rush the decision to begin the attack into what is the most, Andrew's word is fiendishly difficult. Another one of the joys of working with a British author is all the delightful phrases. But this is, we think there's nothing tougher. Yes, the Yom Kippur War, there was a moment where there was a true existential threat to Israel that doesn't exist here. But this is incredibly difficult from the perspective of someone who oversaw lots of urban operations, including as a division commander. You have to go about this very, very carefully. So my advice to Netanyahu first would be, don't just conduct a military operation. Think about this as a civil military operation. And don't just give the order to your forces to go in and destroy Hamas, which means to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. but also announce a vision for the Palestinian people, because you need to pry them away from Hamas. You need to tell them, as we did during the surge, we said, Sunni Arabs, if you'll break with Al-Qaeda, reconcile with us, and then ultimately with the government, we will rid you of Al-Qaeda and would like your support as we do it. And we're talking fighting support, not just, sort of applauding as we go into the fray. We need to tell, they need to tell the Palestinians that if you can get rid of Hamas, life is going to be much better for you, and actually lay out a degree of more than just the generalities, but how they actually envision doing that. We don't want an Israeli commander to experience what we did during the fight to Baghdad. Actually, even before that, 101st Airborne Division, we were ordered to take the city of Najaf. It's about 500,000, holiest city in Shia Islam, so it took extra care. Don't want to have any nicks in the Gold Dome Mosque, all this. 3 days or so of very tough fighting, all 3 brigade combat teams, each of 3,500 troops. And all of a sudden the enemy collapses and we win. And so this is pretty significant. It's the first major city that's been liberated in Iraq. And I called my boss and I said, hey, boss, I got good news and bad news. Good news is we own Najaf. He asked, what's the bad news? I said, we own Najaf. What do you want us to do with it? And there shouldn't be a case in this situation, especially given our experience, which they have studied. And then, of course, later we topple Baghdad and take down the regime. And I'd actually asked in Kuwait, excuse me, can you give us a little more detail on what happens after we get to Baghdad and take down the regime? And they said, yeah, you just get us to Baghdad, Dave. We'll take it from there. Well, that planning turned out it would be charitable to say that it was inadequate. It was wholly lacking, and we paid for that. They have got to think this through. I know that this is incredibly difficult. The Palestinians do not want to ride back into the Palestinian Authority doesn't want to ride into Hamas territory, into Gaza on the backs of Israeli tanks. Many of the Gulf states and others, Egypt and so forth, that express deep concern for the Palestinians, which I think is sincere. But let's see if they'll step up and take a role in this. And keep in mind that what takes over doesn't just have to restore basic services and perform reconstruction, hand out humanitarian assistance. They're going to have a counterinsurgency campaign, because Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad will try to come back. And that's all after this very, very tough urban fight is complete. And keep in mind, this is vastly more difficult than anything we've ever encountered. An enemy who is willing to blow himself up to take you with him, knows the territory very, very well, has 300 miles of tunnels underneath that are very sophisticated. We'll have snipers, improvised explosive devices, again, suicide car and vest bombers, and fights from within civilians, and we'll use these hostages as civilian shields. So it's hard to imagine a fight that's going to be more difficult. It took 9 months for the Iraqi security forces to clear Mosul in northern Iraq, where our headquarters was for the bulk of the first year, roughly the same size. With our help, yes, the Israeli Defense Forces are vastly more capable, but it's still, there's going to be huge casualties. There's going to be a lot of civilian loss, terrible destruction and damage. The optics are going to be very, very grim. And my concern, and what I would express to Prime Minister Netanyahu, again, is you're going to take there's going to be a lot of sacrifice, and you need to ensure that it's worth it. This can't be another case where you mow the lawn, maybe all the way down to the dirt, and then you give it back. And 4 years from now, Hamas and PIDGE are back.
Andrew, yep.
And also, not that I'd say this to Bibi Netanyahu, because he knows it very well and thinks about it constantly. It's not just Gaza that you have to worry about. You've got they've got 520,000 men under arms, including 360,000 reservists. But as well as this coming horrific but utterly necessary operation in Gaza, you also have the West Bank, you have the Israeli Arabs, of course, inside Israel, and you have 150,000 rockets owned by Hezbollah in the north. So it is strategically, as David said, we could not think, we've gone through the book again, and we couldn't think of a more dangerous and difficult operation.
Keep in mind that 20% of the Israeli population is Palestinian. And that's not counting anyone this is the internal population. And again, the vision for the Palestinians should include the West Bank as well. And that has been lacking.
Is it possible, General, given none of you have mentioned, you've all mentioned these various challenges and threats. We haven't mentioned Iran directly. Is it possible to destroy Hamas as they intend to do? Hamas, as we know, is Iran's kind of cat's paw in Gaza. Is it possible, even if it's achievable in overcoming all the difficult tasks that you've outlined, is it possible to do that without triggering a much wider conflict into which the United States itself could be drawn?
It's uncertain. I mean, you can't put odds on this. You have to just be prepared for it. And again, as Andrew said, the possibility of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon using some or all of its 150,000 rockets is particularly worrisome. They will get hammered in return, though, as they did in 2006. That's a different problem, frankly, from the issue of Gaza. And we reassessed several times how substantial the damage Israel did to them, to the point that we don't think that they're not eager to do this. They'll launch a handful of rockets. They'll do this and that to sort of show that they're sympathetic to the cause, but they're going to bring about their own destruction again if they do that. But it's certainly a possibility. We've already seen the news reports that 2 Americans were killed on a base in Iraq. That starts to change the complexion of this, and they were killed undoubtedly with Iranian-provided rockets shot by Iraqi militias supported by Iran. So again, the complexities here, as Andrew said, there's a lot of potential for escalation and regionalization. And it sort of comes back again to Israel needs to say what the vision is, because if the vision is there, we can say, look.
Can we move on very quickly? Because I do want to question the audience, but just my final question is the other big conflict that's ongoing and has been ongoing for getting on for 2 years now is obviously Ukraine. You have a long chapter in the book on Ukraine. We're all familiar with the disastrous performance of the Russian military there. I love that line. I don't know if you repeat it in the book, but we used to think Russia had the second greatest military and the second most powerful military in the world. Now we know it has the second most powerful military in Ukraine. But what they have time is on their side. They have a lot of people, a lot of resources. The West is getting impatient, clearly, and getting distracted, if that's the right word, with these other conflicts. Andrew, just very quickly, I mean, how do you see that? How do you see that evolving?
Well, David and I actually went to Kyiv 4 months ago for this book, and David's been there since to speak to President Zelensky and others. And when we met the ministers and generals, and indeed everybody else, right the way down to young sort of 18, 19-year-old lads who were at the Kyiv Institute of Economics, we saw a absolutely unbreakable resolve that they would ultimately prevail. And of course, that morale is not the same today as it was quite when we went there 4 months ago. But nonetheless, there is absolutely no willingness whatsoever to put up with the idea of Russia controlling 18 or 19% of their country in the short, medium, or long term.
But again, we talk about politics.
But it's uncertain.
The politics,
it's
changing
uncertain.
in this country. We can see that the United States, we see the debates going on in Congress about additional assistance. Russia doesn't have that problem, as far as we're aware. They can, when they do get domestic problems, they push them out of tall buildings or blow up their plane as they're coming back as they're flying internally. Is this? I mean, General, how do you see it? I mean, are we just in this for a very, very long term? Is there some kind of resolution in the near future?
Look, I taught economics in an earlier academic life, and you can never go wrong by starting an answer by saying it depends. And it does depend. It depends on, by the way, Putin has never fully mobilized Russia, and he doesn't want to, because then he feels that he might actually lose the support. He's tried to keep it out of Moscow, as you know, as well. It's all those that are out in the rural areas that are bearing the burden of this fight. And the casualties are absolutely horrific. There are many, many, many times just in the first 19 months that they were in nearly 10 years in Afghanistan. But he still does think that the Russians will be able to outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans. We have to prove him wrong, and I hope that we will, and we should. This is as right versus wrong as it can get, I think, in contemporary times. Including as right versus wrong as Hamas doing what they did to innocent Israeli civilians.
Great, thank you. Questions, please. We've got a lot of people, I'm sure, with a lot of interesting questions. There's a lady at the front. We have a microphone, I think.
Please
you bring-
wait for a microphone.
Yep, lady at the front here with her hand up in the third row here. Thank you.
And thank you to the Dylan Schneiders. These lectures have been really edifying. Where does humanitarian aid fit in the Gaza? area?
Remember where I said that there has to be a vision that says that life will be better if you get rid of Hamas. And that's part and parcel of that. I mean, again, if you're going to make life better, you got to, number one, right now, see to the immediate humanitarian needs. And then second, very quickly, literally as you liberate areas, if you will, or as you clear and hold areas. And what you have to do, by the way, you can't leave an area. You have to clear every building, every room, every cellar, every tunnel, and then you have to keep it. You have to retain it. So you have to leave a sizable force behind so that that force can't get swarmed and become hostages. And this is the way we did the major cities that we cleared, Ramadi, Fallujah. We finally did Fallujah the third time and kept it clear. We segmented it into 12 different neighborhoods, walled them all off and all. It was quite extraordinary. That's the way you have to go about this. But as you actually clear an area, they ought to start taking care of the civilians. They need to show this is not about words, although words are necessary, but then it's about the deeds that match those words. And there does have to be humanitarian assistance. And that's why I'm pleased to see that our president and members of Congress have emphasized that as well.
More questions, please. Yes, gentleman right at the back there, please.
Sure, thank you. What role does nationalistic fervor or religious fervor play in our ability to transform the countries that we have entered into? It seems like we have these initial successes, but over a period of time, it fades. So what's the real reason behind that?
Well, you've got to communicate to them that there is wisdom in doing what it is, if essentially that we're hoping to do. We have done this successfully. When I took command of the surge, we had something like 17 or 18,000 Iraqi detainees. This is not a trivial number. It went up to something like 25,000 because I said, we have to stop releasing detainees because what we're doing is we're actually running a terrorist training camp. In other words, the extremists in these enclosures, we took very good care of them. They probably had the best healthcare in all of Iraq, very good food, 3 square meals and all the rest of that. But we needed to get the extremists out of their midst because they were radicalizing the individuals in there. And then we needed literally to do moderation classes. And we did. Of course, there's Iraqis that did it and Iraqi clerics. And then we had jobs train programs. We bought a huge bread and brick making plant and all these other things. And they actually had a skill when they went back to their communities, having had an effort to try to convince them that the extremism that they had been supporting, which got them end up in jail, is probably not what they wanted to continue when they went back to their community. And then in the community, we would have the tribal leaders take charge of them. There was a judicial component, and then there was a government component. But that's the kind of effort you have to take. It is not easy, but it all starts again with the right message, and then a message that is truly operationalized, words that are followed by deeds. It's a very, very tough issue.
And I think also your phrase about religious and nationalistic fervor comes to the fore very much with regard to Gaza, because after Hamas has been extirpated, it's absolutely vital to ensure that the education system that is taken on after that in Gaza, hopefully also the West Bank, does not teach 8-year-old Palestinian Arabs that it's acceptable to kill Jews. That has to change. Otherwise, we're in for another generational conflict.
And, let's be real clear-eyed about Hamas, by the way. Their founding document calls for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews. That's not a negotiating partner. This is not Anwar Sadat, who wants to reach a peace agreement with Israel that endures to this day.
More questions. There's a lady here in the middle If you could just, yes, lady with it.
Just as a reminder, Elm Street Books is here selling copies of Conflict available for purchase.
Only 50 left.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I love your suggestion that the Palestinians ought to reject Hamas. How do we get the group of Palestinians to reject Hamas when Israel is still building their houses and stuff on
Settlements.
land that is not that is not allowed?
Yep. Sure. So let me explain the big idea that I believe should be guiding the efforts over there is that, okay, if you don't have sufficient Palestinian leadership that could actually compromise, and they don't, and they haven't for a number of years, and if you don't have Israeli leadership that is sufficiently supported in its coalition and the body politic, that it can make compromises, then at least you shouldn't create more obstacles to the eventual achievement of the only path forward. There is no alternative to a two-state solution. A one-state solution in which which encompasses all of the West Bank and Gaza is one in which Palestinians will outvote the Israeli Jews. So it's obviously not possible. And yet, as you point out, they have been creating more obstacles to the eventual completion of a two-state solution. And that's why I said there should be, and that's why Andrew also said there should be a vision for the West Bank as well as for Gaza.
Yes. Question, gentleman, right at the back with his hand up there in the cap.
No, sorry.
Yes.
No, behind you. I'll come to you next. So we got to. Yeah.
Oh,
Go
that
ahead.
man has 5 books, so he.
Yeah.
He wins the prize.
We should give him 2 questions, but
Yes,
you only get one.
question for both of you. Why do you think that America is hated so much around the world?
And
First of all, I don't think America's hated so much
Yeah.
around the world. I think America's envied a great deal around the world. In some cases, that turns into enmity.
seems to be hated more on American campuses, university campuses, than it is in most of the parts of the rest of the
Yeah.
world. Actually, But,
I think a huge number of people in the world love America, and that's why they want to come and live here. That's why they recognize that it's one of the greatest countries in the world. They want democracy. They want human rights. So actually, I think what would be better to ask is why do so many governments, why many governments in the world want to basically squeeze everything out of America that they possibly can, but at the same time, it does not represent ordinary people around the world.
yeah, the best line I think I heard on that. Amy Chua, who's a sort of sociologist and lawyer, wrote a fabulous book called World on Fire about globalization, about 20 years, and it was about populations and the attitudes that people had towards America, particularly towards American intervention, the importance of American products and companies in their lives, but also the sort of American military power. And she said the rest of the world's attitude towards America could generally be summed up as America, get out and take me with you. Anyway, yes, sir. The one you were going to ask your question before. Just wait for the microphone, please.
I only got one book, so
You can still ask a question. Just make it
Okay.
short.
in the context
Get more.
in the context of the Ukraine and Gaza, what is the leadership of mainland China thinking in terms of Taiwan? Is this an opportune moment to go for broke, or are they afraid when they see how much resistance can occur when you're dealing with the free people?
It's connected. First of all, let me start and then I'll hand off to his lordship here. I think that the invasion of Ukraine and Russia losing the battles of Kyiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv Oblast, Kherson, and so forth, even though the lines have been relatively static over recent months, nonetheless is a cautionary tale to China in a couple of different ways. One is just how hard this has turned out to be for their partner supposedly without limits, although they have imposed limits, but also the way the U.S. has responded. I think Putin not only overestimated the capabilities of his forces, underestimated the capabilities of the Ukrainian forces, and President Zelensky, a brilliant strategic leader, by the way, he also underestimated the U.S. response and that of NATO and the rest of the Western world. Now, perhaps there was reason for that He saw us withdraw from Afghanistan, even though we hadn't taken a casualty and a loss in 18 months, and it wasn't costing that much. We had a red line that wasn't a red line. There have been a number of other episodes. And we have to be very conscious that these actions reverberate. They're all connected. And that's one of the big themes in the book as well. We have agency here. Deterrence rests on two factors. It's the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to use them on the other. And we should make sure there's no doubt about those and that we are shoring up our capabilities, hardening them, going underground, dispersing them, defending them, and everything else. And again, making sure without being provocative. There's no need to be needlessly provocative, but you do need to be firm. But again, we should keep in mind that if the small element in Congress that opposes aid for Ukraine is able to prevail because of the way they constructed the ability to take down a speaker, that will reverberate out in the Indo-Pacific region.
Also, I think it's worth remembering that President Xi knows perfectly well that US troops themselves are not fighting either in Ukraine or in Gaza, that you are a country that can fight on more than one front, and that you are spending on deterrence vast amounts more than any other country in the world. And so what I think is one of the takeaways of this, actually in this book, the interconnectedness that David was talking about, but also the vital amounts, the vital importance of having large amounts of money spent on defense, which is, if it works in deterrence, and it certainly is working with regard to China and Taiwan at the moment, an infinitesimally small amount compared to the amount of money you have to spend if you're going to fight a war.
One final question we've just got time for. I want to make sure I'm getting a fair geographic distribution. Yes, gentleman over there with the beard.
That's me. Okay. I totally agree with your assessment of leadership and the four traits. And I'm wondering, at what point does it become necessary for, say, Israel to, go after the bigger enemy for them, which is regionally Iran, and seems to be at the core of all of this. So I'm wondering what you think about, would that be doable for Israel at this point to go after Iran in that head-on kind of way?
First of all, according to the press, at least.
Who believes the press?
Well, I generally do.
Some more than others, I would say.
Yeah. Especially when they're writing kind reviews about our book. According to the press, Israel has really been going after Iran quite assiduously and successfully. In fact, we recount in the book an episode where Petraeus, the head of the nuclear program, allegedly, according to the press, again, some of these I can't get into that much detail given my last job in government, but was killed by a machine gun that was unmanned and was essentially had visual recognition. It had a lot of technology connected with it and monitored, allegedly, according to the press, in Israel. And as a particular vehicle went by, it identified the target and basically autonomously pulled the trigger, and that individual was brought to justice. There are a number of other cases, a number of them that are actually public. There are even more that are not. If you read David Sanger's book about Stuxnet and some of these others, again, there have been very, very impressive and considerable both physical and also virtual and other attacks carried out. The idea of a direct confrontation, I'm just not sure how you would operationalize that idea. The one thing you can be sure of is that Israel will not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But of course, the U.S. has pledged that as well, and we have capabilities that they don't have. They're all publicly known also. And that's one of the red lines that I believe we would take action were it to be crossed. Let me actually end, if I okay. Let me end.
Last word then.
With I want to build on what Andrew said earlier about the value of money spent on deterrence, given that it turns out to be a lot less than if you actually have to engage in a confrontation in a war. But beyond that, I think, I hope that out of this, you have a sense that both of us believe that U.S. leadership in the world is absolutely crucial, that if we do not exercise it, no one else will, no one else can, and that it's in our national interest. We're not doing this, for charitable reasons. We're doing this because it is best for America and for Americans, and yes, also for our allies and partners and democracy and the values that we hold dear around the world. And again, if we don't do it, no one else will. And I would submit that, and it comes out in the book, that we face the greatest number of challenges and the greatest complexity of challenges, at least since the end of the Cold War. But we have allies and partners uniquely who help us, if you will, keep the plate spinning, which is a way perhaps to think of these. If we maintain those relationships, if we show that we value allies, particularly if the one with whom we have a special relationship. And so again, that phrase, the indispensable nation and so forth, I really believe in that. And I hope that our leaders will be able to continue to convince Americans how important it is to continue to support a democracy that has been brutally invaded in an unprovoked case, Russia on Ukraine, a partner in closest partner in the Middle East, again, who has sustained losses that are unfathomable, as I laid out right up front. And then what we do elsewhere in the world to keep an eye still on Islamist extremist groups that could reconstitute if that pressure is lifted, as we saw with the case of the Islamic State. And above all, to ensure that the severe competition, as our national security advisor describes a relationship between the US and the West and China, never erupts into direct confrontation. And the way to do that is, again, by ensuring that deterrence is solid. And again, we think that that investment is very, very well spent.
That is a great note on which to end. Thank you very much indeed. General, thank you. We don't have no more time, I'm afraid. Sorry. Thank you. I do want to end with 3 sets of thanks. Thanks, first of all, to all of you for coming, for listening, for your questions, and of course, from their point of view, for buying the book. Thank you very much indeed. I want to thank again Bob and Jan Dillenschneider for making this possible. This wonderful series of lectures. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Bob and Jan. And of course, thanks to our terrific authors, Lord Roberts of Belgravia. Can't believe they let you get that name, Belgravia, Andrew. Somebody must have had that. Surely the wonderful Lord Roberts of Belgravia and General David Petraeus. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thanks, Jim. Thank you. Quick question.